has been that the Trump administration looks at defense in a very different way from most previous U.S. administrations. Hence, a lot of the European and other ally states feel that the U.S. might not honor some of the commitments that it used to have. It might flip-flop on its opposition to Russian expansion or threats um, from other powers. And there seem to be some signs that the US is seeking some kind of divide and conquer agreement with China as well, which would see middle powers like European powers pushed to the side. So it's becoming very urgent that Europe should look much better after its own defenses. And finally, some European lawmakers do seem to be waking up to this. Whereas previously people used to have discussions around this topic but didn't do much. And that's why now there's a discussion of something that's supposed to build up the European defense sector somewhat. We already had a European defense fund, but as you can see, this was a rather minor thing, about 8 billion euros. Now, if you compare that with, for example, the US's military spending, that's about 800 billion dollars a year, so around 750 billion euros, and China's is around 200 billion dollars, probably more in real terms. So now there is talk of European defense mechanism. Now the interesting thing would be that the EDM would create an actual common market in the defense industry, a single market, and that would be good because until now defense companies have been protected from having to compete, which was nice for national level economies, but it prevented many European companies from having to compete and becoming better, innovating, and also from growing, because the orders that they received were usually limited by the size of their national economies within which they operated. Now, if you have the 28 European NATO members all working together to have a European defense mechanism that creates a European defense market, and maybe some other allies like the UK, Norway, and Switzerland join in, that would be a considerable market, almost the same size economically as the US is in terms of GDP, real term GDP, as well as GDP PPP, and such a single market and bigger EU investment in such a single market could enable Europe to have a competitive defense, which would help Europe to reduce its dependence on the US, which is very useful because, of course, depending on the US is good in some sense. The US spends more on defense. The US has a very developed defense sector, amazing fighter jets, amazing rockets, amazing nuclear weapons, and so on. Drones, cutting-edge technology in many sectors. But if we have US governments which are hostile to Europe or not that friendly, not that supportive as some US governments used to be, then Europe needs to look out for its own interests more strongly. And of course, the US does use its military always to as a bargaining chip, right, to get better access for its companies to certain markets, to exert diplomatic pressure, media pressure, and so on and so on. So Europe really hasn't done enough. The US always criticizes Europe of not having invested enough. But what the US usually means is the European countries are not spending enough on ordering equipment from American companies. Now, this is not the goal. The European countries should definitely not pour even more money and funds into the US defense sector, which is already very well funded and highly developed. What Europe should do should be to rationalize its military market, and rather than having a lot of different producers produce similar competing models, um, develop a much better, much better um, set of military satellites to have our own GPS and intelligence capabilities, and that would augment our first strike and retaliatory strike capabilities, and it could help to develop, of course, a lot of important communication related technology. And what are the big problems with this? Well, the big problems with this are that at the moment, because of the low unit numbers due to the fragmented European defense market, production costs are quite high. If we would have consistent higher production costs, costs would be lower. Um, we could try to um, establish um, much more talent acquisition related to the defense industry as well, because those are usually well-paying jobs. The problem is, of course, we need to get beyond free riding, and we need to get beyond the idea that defense has to be entirely a national question. Of course, many aspects of defense should be, but some aspects of defense should not be. Some aspects of defense should be common, because simply scale is needed in today's world when you are competing with China, the US, and Russia, and larger and larger economies across the globe. You look at Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, all growing very fast. India coming up, of course, as well. And what you see is that most European countries have been spending around 2% of their GDP on defense related expenses. So the US sticking point that European countries don't do this is not true. It's just a talking point that they like to repeat because they would like more orders from Europeans for their countries. But it's true that there's a lot of fiscal fragmentation, which means this 2% a lot less efficient than it could be if it would be pooled. So some of the things that we need to really boost are supply side policies. A lot of the European weapons use different ammunition, for example, different standards, so they're not necessarily compatible systems. And some of the other things, procurement coordination. The European militaries would be a lot more effective if there would be coordination in what and when they buy. Fiscal constraints need to be freed up. That is, especially the larger economies should be able to, at the beginning, invest more in developing the most urgently needed capabilities, which is probably having good satellite and intelligence coverage independently of the US and the UK, or at least to be on par, nearly on par with them. Mm. And right, these are not the only issues. Some of the other things is that how we do this in Europe. Well, one way to do it is by small, growing investments. There have been successful European level programs which have this model, or a more transformational solution where the EU takes this to be an urgent issue, and for any nation that opts in, it supports releasing bonds to cover some of the finances, and help to speed up this process considerably. If you want to read the detailed report, there is a lot of recent discussion of this. Bruegel, who are a think tank focusing on EU policies and looking at the EU as having its own interest. Of course, the EU is a partner of the US in many aspects, economically, financially, militarily, but that doesn't mean that there's always total alignment and Europe shouldn't consider its own interest and shouldn't do more to be able to enforce its own interests. At the moment, the enforcement is of course very weak because of the reliance on the US. So have a look at the report. It's very exciting. This discussion has been going on for a while now, since everyone knew that with President Trump and his incoming administration there will be big shifts in US policies, and a lot of instability and incalculability. The discussion is going on, and hopefully we will see action on it, which would be a very exciting and progressive initiative. A lot of good can come of it in terms of job creation, technological innovation, and it can give an economic boost to the EU in general, and hopefully widen Europe's area of maneuverability in politics and economics as well, which is very important if you look at it, that we are getting sadly back into a position where we have been for a long time, when we had a bipolar world divided between the Soviet Union and the US into spheres of interest and dominated by these two large superpowers. We are getting back to a position where there is a US-China rivalry, and there is a danger that you have to choose sides and align your policies to a very large extent with one of these two superpowers, which is of course not good for any middle or small country. And if we have a more balanced international landscape in terms of power, if there are at least three large powers, both economically and militarily, then there is a lot more space for movement diplomatically, financially, in science, in healthcare, in every way, for countries to choose their own interests and models. But thanks all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little rundown of a very interesting and current topic, and hope to see you guys around again.